Hi dearest lovely, my name is Kaylin Vu and it's such a pleasure to meet you. I'm the founder of Dear Lovely Universe. My mission is to help people live their best lives possible by transforming them into the best versions of themselves. So I'm here today with Mindy McGinnis. She is a writer, a published author, and a podcaster for aspiring and published authors. I'm so excited to be here with Mindy because in our pre-interview, she had a lot of really good information that she shared with me, and I'm so excited to share it with you. So let's welcome Mindy to the podcast.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited. So can you tell listeners more about yourself?
Sure. So I'm from Ohio. I still live here in Ohio. I'm a farmer's daughter. I grew up in the middle of nowhere. I graduated from a very small town where I still live, and we're still extremely small. My last graduating class this past year, my niece was in it, and they graduated 68 kids. So we're super small, super rural. And my whole life, I always knew that I wanted to be a writer. I didn't know how a person went about becoming a writer, what that was like, what that process was like. And I didn't know it was something that I was more or less allowed to do. I didn't know that it was something that you could achieve or accomplish without having already had connections or knowing someone. And I'm a farmer's daughter from Ohio. So I went to college and I graduated with a degree in English literature. I never took any writing classes, but I graduated with English literature. I double majored in that and religion, and went on to be a librarian at the school that I graduated from. And I worked there for 14 years, and I had been at that point in my life trying to get published, going through the traditional steps of getting an agent and attempting to get an agent and be noticed by bigger publishing houses in New York. And it took me 10 years to get an agent. I started writing when I was in college, seriously writing with the intent of being published. And I did not get published until 2013. I graduated from high school in 1997. So I had been working at it my entire life, from my fully formed, like later teenage years until early 30s. And I was fortunate enough to find an agent. It took a long time, 10 years, 4 failed novels. My 5th novel was the first one that got picked up by a publisher. And so I have been extremely fortunate, and the perseverance and the hard work has paid off. My 10th novel comes out in February, and I am fortunate enough to be able to be a writer full time. I still work from home and have been working from home for I think 5 years now. And interestingly enough, a lot of people ask me about writing during the pandemic and during the quarantine particularly. And I had been doing that previously for a few years. And I kind of jokingly tell people that, you know, the world ended in many ways, but my life didn't change. My daily routine did not change at all. And that was both a godsend, and it saved me because I already knew how to do this. But it also was kind of alarming, like socially, to realize that I'm like that cut off from, you know, a social life and a lot of the world simply by dint of what I do.
Yeah, well, that's so amazing I think it's so amazing how you persevered, and now you're about to have your 10th novel released. I mean, that is just amazing. It goes to show that you can work hard and really achieve anything. If you have your mind to it, then you can achieve it.
Yes, and if you're willing to learn from your mistakes, I probably could have been published sooner, except I wasn't doing some of the work on the work end of being a writer. The creativity side was always what I had focused on, inspiration and writing. And I just wanted to be a writer and only be a writer and, you know, be up in an ivory tower and have someone notice me and realize that I was great. And it just doesn't work that way. You have to learn how to market yourself, and you have to learn how to write something called a query letter in order to get an agent. And it's a very difficult piece of work to write because it is essentially a marketing pitch, and you're marketing yourself and your book. And I didn't want to go through the steps of learning how to write that way. All I wanted to do was be a fiction writer. And so I was resistant to
Mhm.
the steps that were going to be necessary in order for me to get what I wanted. I just wanted what I wanted. I didn't want to have to do the very, very tedious work. And once I buckled down and said, okay, you're gonna have to tackle this from all edges and not just be like, I'm a writer, that's what I do. You also have to learn how to be published and study the market and know who the agents are and who they work for, what their agencies are. And, it was a real eye opener for me. And I don't believe it would have taken me as long as it did to get published if I hadn't been as hard headed. But I'm also glad that it did take me as long as it did, because while some of the things that I had written before my first published novel might have been publishable, I don't think they were necessarily strong or representative of what I was capable of. I had to grow also as a creative writer and just, become better at my craft.
Totally. And it's so amazing that you recognize that, I believe that every challenge almost forces us to grow. And
Oh, yes.
so, yeah, I'm wondering, what do you have like a process that you go through, or what's the dreamy life of being an entrepreneur? What does that look like for you?
So it depends. Every day is essentially different, and I'm fortunate enough that I'm able to write full time. I don't work outside of writing. However, I do a ton of things that have nothing to do with writing. So I have 10 books published under my own name. I also do some co-authoring with friends under a pen name. And of course, I have my own podcast. It's called Writer Pants on Fire. That podcast has been going for, I think, 4 years. I have a blog for writers of the same name that's been running since 2011. And I also offer editorial services. I do 10-page critiques, query critiques, and then I will do full manuscript critiques for people as well. So I don't necessarily live off of just my money from writing. I also do public speaking and, school visits, and I go to libraries and book clubs and things like that. And so when the pandemic hit, that all stopped and I became entirely, an at-home worker. So the daily life can be super different every day. Like there are days, for example, there was one day last fall when I was supposed to be attending an independent bookstore owners convention, and I think it was in Phoenix, but I'm just guessing, I don't remember. And I got up at 5 a.m. and flew to Phoenix and had a panel and had a presentation and spoke with people and signed books and got on a plane and flew back home and got home at like 1 a.m. the next day. Sometimes it's that. Sometimes it's I get up at like 9 or 9:30 and I try to run every morning. I'm not a fantastic runner. I'm not a great runner, but I do it just to get me awake. So I run about 2 miles every morning and eat something, check the news, hit all my social media channels. And then I have a varying degree of things. Sometimes I have a podcast I need to edit. Sometimes I spend usually about 2 hours at least on email anymore these days, answering emails. Very little time actually spent writing, if I'm being honest. Even when I'm working really hard at a project, if I have a deadline hanging over my head, I'm probably only actively writing maybe 3 or 4 hours out of the day, and that's generous. I mean, typically I'll write an hour and a half, maybe 2 a day. But right now, for example, I have a book due September 1st, and then I have something else that's coming down the pipe that's going to be published soon that has to get finished. And I have a podcast episode myself that's supposed to go up on Monday that I haven't even started editing yet. So like today, as soon as I get done with this, I have to decide if I'm working on one of these 2 writing projects or if I'm going to work on the podcast episode. And I just kind of have to balance which need is greatest. So most of the time I'm just kind of looking at deadlines and deciding which thing is the most prominent as far as pressure.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, I know when you have a lot going on, sometimes it's like an act of balance. And I think, like you said, deadlines. So, there's a lot going on. How do you, I know you mentioned, let me just plug in my computer really quickly because
Yeah.
it's going to die. But I know you mentioned that writers have depression prevalent in the community. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts about that?
It's very much something that we as a group have started talking about more. There's a lot of different feelings about it, to be honest with you. I mean, I speak very openly about my own depression, and about different ways that I handle it. But some people don't necessarily want to talk about their depression and anxiety, which I understand completely. Some people also take issue with writers who talk about their depression as if it is a source of creativity or a blessing almost. And that's something that some people can be like pretty passionate about, is that we shouldn't celebrate it, that we shouldn't talk about depression as if it was a gift that was given to us to help us with our craft. I don't know where I land on that particular subject. I think if someone were to say to me, hey, I could remove depression from your life entirely with this magic wand, would I still be as good of a writer? I don't know, because I don't know how closely the two things are linked. I think what we see in creative writers, especially in fiction authors, is that what we all excel at is noticing the details. We notice details, we watch people, we can read people, and the world can be and is a pretty ugly place sometimes. And one of the other things that you have to have in order to be a good writer is empathy. So not only are you seeing other people suffering and acknowledging that, that's sympathy, but when you actually feel it, when you feel someone else's pain, when their pain is disturbing emotionally to you, that's empathy. And in order for us to be able to be good writers, we have to feel empathy. A very good writer is going to be able to take an emotion and make the reader feel that just by reading the words that we put on the page. And we're making total strangers feel the emotions of a person that doesn't even exist in fiction anyway, by reading what we wrote. So you have to know how to flip those switches. You have to know how to, for lack of a better word, manipulate emotions. And in order to do that, you yourself have to be proficient at emotions, and at least noticing them and being aware of different switches and what pulls them. And in order to be that, you have to be extremely observant and have that deep, deep well of empathy. And unfortunately, so much of what is in the world today, and maybe it's always been that way, we're just exposed to it more now, is ugly. And it's hard to wallow in that pool all of the time. Interestingly, I write really dark. I write books about tough subjects, hard things, rough stuff, super gritty. That's what I write. I myself, I do suffer from depression, and I can have like tremendous anxiety, but it's all manageable. When people meet me, I am generally a happy person. And when people meet me, people who have read my books or have only read one or two of my books, they're surprised that I am not like complete goth. Like I'm not just, completely walking around like with absinthe and, a black top hat. And that's not the case. I don't necessarily even wake up and look for a positive thought every day. I just power through. I muscle on. I put my head down and I plow through it. And that's how I deal with it. I'm also fond of naps, and it's something that I've talked to my therapist about like quite a bit, because I have some guilt result in that, because my family is a very like hardworking family, and I'm a hard worker. I will grind to get things done. And sometimes like it can just sometimes be purely being sleepy, but sometimes it's just like I'm emotionally overwhelmed by one thing or another. And sometimes the way depression works, it can be something really small. It can just be a series of small things. Like I got a little dent in my car when I went to get groceries, and then on the way home, I saw a cat that had been hit on the road, and it was really upsetting to me. And, you know, all of these things. And then it just kind of rolls until it's like nothing matters, everything is stupid. And then I get home and I'm just like, I feel terrible. And sometimes I'll just take a nap. And I've been talking to my therapist about that. And it's kind of a hard reset for me. And she's like, if sleeping is your way of escaping reality for a little while, that is so much more healthy than drinking or drugs. And I'm like, okay, cool. So permission to nap. That's something that I've been saying to a lot of my friends who are dealing with tough things. I'm like, you have permission to nap. My therapist says that it's a good coping mechanism. So permission to nap is granted.
Yeah, I love that. I think that you don't need permission from anyone but yourself to do or start or end something, because, you know, at the end of the day, it's your life.
Yep.
And yeah, and yeah, she's totally right that it is a lot better than smoking or drinking to escape. I think it's actually healthy to take naps
Yep.
often. Yeah, yeah. But when when you were talking about how you write about really dark things, but and people would expect you to look a certain way, I think you could be who you are inside and not have to portray a certain look. You could just be who you are naturally.
Yeah. And a lot of people ask me, because I do speak openly about depression and things like that. They ask me, how is it difficult to write these hard things, to write these dark things? No, actually. And the reason why I managed to be healthy mentally and physically at this moment in time anyway is because I take all those dark things, I take all those bad things, the scary things, the gritty things, the hard things, the true things, I take those things out and I put them on the page. And that, I mean, it really is a form of therapy that I've been practicing my whole life. I just didn't know that's what I was doing. So that is something, it's a question that I'm asked a lot. It's like, how do you handle such tough subjects? How do you write about this? How do you sit down in front of a computer and do this every day? That's just how my brain works. It always has. I'm always thinking worst possible outcome. And I don't understand how someone that writes rom-coms can sit down and write like a happy love story. I don't get that. My brain has never worked that way. But people don't ask them, you know, is it difficult to sit down and write a meet cute? You know, everybody's like, oh, that's sweet. That's what you write. And that person could be completely torn apart in the inside, and no one would know or expect them to be. And that's really unfair.
Yeah, that's a really good point to make. When you're saying that, it made me start to wonder, does your inspiration to write come from like personal experiences, or is it like creative? Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
It's interesting. I am lucky. I've used this term before to describe my life. Um, Nuclear family, parents loved each other, lived in the country, raised, you know, wonderfully, never lacked for anything. Like, we certainly didn't have money, but I was never hungry. Never been physically abused, sexually abused, emotionally abused, mentally abused, like none of that. I cannot explain why I am the way I am. I've just always leaned toward darker things. My interest is in the grit and in truly like horrible things at times, like that just what draws me and what has my interest. And there is no, I mean, obviously I've had not just being a woman moving through the world, I've had things happen to me, but I have never been in an assault situation or anything like that. And rape is something that I do write about quite a bit. And a lot of people do assume that I have been raped simply because it's a topic that I write about, and I haven't. I hope that that doesn't take away any of my any of the truth that I bring to the page, but I have a lot of people that kind of make that assumption. But the truth is that, you know, a woman moving through the world doesn't have to make a lot of leaps to land on that possibility.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. Let's, you talked a little bit about, you know, being the way that you are, being interested in gritty stuff. And I think that's amazing that you know what you're into and you accept that. And I think that's beautiful. I mean, I've always had a little darker side to myself. Like I can be this like girly girl, or I could also be this like, I don't know. There's different sides, and I think it's beautiful to know what you're into.
Mm-hmm.
But I think something that we talked about before is how people ask themselves like, why am I this way? You know, and what would you want to say to those people?
I would say don't necessarily question it if it's not something that you're ashamed of. If it is something that brings you joy, even if it's a type of perverse joy, because like I am interested in those horrible headlines. Those are the ones I'm going to click on. You know, I think I grew up wondering if this was wrong or if I was weird for being interested in darker things, especially being a female, if that was wrong, quite frankly. And I don't see any evidence in my life anyway. I'm very healthy emotionally, mentally, physically, that damage has been done to me through this interest and exploring my interests and even making a living on writing about grit and hard things and darkness. I think that I've just always known it about myself that that was what I was interested in. And I have to give credit to my parents, especially my mother, because when I was young, there was never any censorship in my home ever. I was allowed to read whatever I wanted to read, watch what I wanted to watch. No one ever said, maybe that's too much. Like, it was never something that I was being like protected from. And because I had interest in darker subjects, you know, as a little kid, you know, I would take out like, you know, the ghost stories from the library and things like that. And I would completely freak myself out. Like I would stay up all night and then be convinced that something was under my bed or in my closet. And of course I had a ridiculous imagination. And so I'd end up sleeping on the floor in my parents' room, like right up till 6th grade. And then, you know, I started reading Stephen King, like at a very young age, probably, I want to say 5th or 6th grade. And my mom said, you can read this, but the second that you're back on the floor next to my bed, you have to stop. And I'm like, okay. So, you know, I started reading Stephen King, and it's not just the paranormal, like he talks about dark things like within regular human beings as well. And in a way, it was just this huge relief to read these books where human beings were not necessarily always doing the right thing or being correct or being good or being perfect, because a lot of the books that were written, in fact almost all of the books that were written for teenagers and for middle grade and for junior high, which was the age I was, it was always people doing the right thing. Like they might be tempted to go do the wrong thing, but it was all a big, you know, morality lesson. Mm-hmm. And it didn't necessarily make me feel bad, but it was just never interesting. And when I did read something that caught my attention, the reason why it did was usually the villain. I would be like, oh, but what about that? It's like, what do they want? Why are they this way? Like, that's what's interesting to me. This person that is choosing to do the wrong thing. I want to know about them. And I always had a lot of empathy for villains in any story. And again, didn't necessarily feel bad about that, but also was aware that that wasn't how I was supposed to be reacting. So when I got to read books that were written for adults that acknowledged the gray area of human nature, it was such a relief. It was such a relief to see real human beings being portrayed and not being damned, you know, for making mistakes and things like that, or having darker interests. And so it was just such a relief to see an adult, like in this case, you know, Stephen King, writing about like the kinds of things I was interested in without guilt or shame. And then my mom saying, no, it's okay, you can read that. Like that was such a blessing and such a boon to me, and definitely shaped me. People ask me all the time, like, who are your literary influences? And obviously Stephen King is one. And people always are like, yeah, we can see it. And that's cool to me. Like, I'm glad. And I don't know, I think that a lot of the times parents make the mistake of shielding their children from a lot of different things and not necessarily letting them explore safely, which is what fiction is. It's safe practice. And so a lot of the times I think a lot of censorship is just heavily misguided.
Yeah, I can definitely see how, you know, people censor their children, and it's just really unfortunate because it's like kids have their minds of their own, and they're gonna get exposed to it eventually anyway. But I love the point that you brought up about how when you're in like middle school and high school, they're always like showing you like the lighthearted stuff, and it's just so, I don't know, irritating to me because I'm sure like they mean well and whatever, but I think the truth is that when people are constantly being shown how they're supposed to be and stuff like that, they can question themselves.
Yep.
Like, why do I feel this way? Why am I this? Why am I that? And it's so important to have an open mind about everything out there and not just only read about or learn about one certain kind of topic.
Yeah.
Yeah. My dad is always like advocating, he's like, you should read about everything. And although I do try, I always tend to, I love nonfiction and like personal development books. But that's, yeah, I'm trying. So I want to know what you mentioned, like self-starting a lot, and I really love that. And I want to know, can you just share with the listeners a little bit about, you know, your experience of self-starting? What does that mean?
So basically, when I decided that I wanted to be a writer, and I realized that anyone truly can be a writer, I was surprised, for one thing. I mean, like I said, I was just kind of waiting for permission. I was waiting for someone to say, you're a writer, right? It doesn't work that way. So I realized that if I wanted to do this and I wanted to be a writer and have it be my living, or at least even something that I did or accomplished, I was going to have to take all those steps, and I was going to have to do it on my own. Nobody's going to help me. No one in my family or in my community is connected with publishing or knows anything about it. So this was like late 90s, and we would have to, like, I would have to print out a query letter and mail it to agents in New York. And they send you back usually a rejection, which sometimes it's usually just a little card back then that they would check, you know, no, thank you. Or they would check, please send the first 10 pages, or please send the whole novel. Most of the time it was no, thank you. And as someone that had grown up being, you know, top 10% of the class and always doing the right thing and doing your homework and being smart and all these things, it was really hard to just like hit a brick wall where it's like, no, you're not good enough. And I mean, it wasn't a shock by any means. I knew this was a tough road to hoe that I had chosen. When I got my first rejection letter, I cried. I was like, oh, I can't do this. And I was like, well, I mean, either you quit or you keep trying. That's all there is to it. And if you quit, you are definitely not going to get what you want. And so I am just really bullheaded. I am super stubborn. Sometimes I put my foot down about the wrong things, but this particular time I was just like, nope, I'm going to keep trying. And it did take me 10 years and 4 failed novels before I was able to get an agent and then from there sell a book. And it was just this idea that no one's going to do it for me. I am the only person that can make this happen. And if I quit, number one, nobody else is even gonna care, right? Like, I am the only person that has something writing on this. Like, I had people that supported me. I had people that were like, yeah, go do that. That's great. But they can't make it happen for me. And if I fail, the only person I'm hurting is me, right? And not putting anything on the line by failing, it's just my ego. So I just had to be willing to keep taking like punches right to the throat over and over and over and over. Now I say that, and I have to add that I did quit multiple times. So a lot of the times when I hear authors giving advice to aspiring writers and they say things like, never give up, I don't agree. I think it's perfectly healthy and normal and probably the right choice to give up occasionally, because when you are getting rejection after rejection after rejection, it wears you down and it makes you just emotionally crushed, and it makes it difficult to write. It makes it difficult to work. And so I would have spurts where I would be like, I'm going to do this. And I would get in there and I would send out queries and send out another batch of 10 queries and get rejections and send out 10 more. And then revise the query letter and go out again. And then after like enough rejections accumulated, I'd be like, okay, I can't take this anymore. And I would stop. At the same time, I'm still writing. So you can't query a book until it's finished. So I would be like, okay, I'm not going to query anymore because this book isn't getting anywhere. I'm going to write the next book and then I'll query that one. So there's always some light on the horizon where it's like, it's not necessarily your writing that is turning them off. It's just this particular book. Like, they know they can't sell this book at this time. I had an agent who's very, very well known in the YA sector, which is who I write for. And I sent her basically an urban fantasy book. And it was my 4th finished novel. And I sent her this urban fantasy and she asked to read the entire thing. So I sent her the entire novel. And she got back to me, which, I mean, that's a period of time of like 6 months. She gets back to me and she's like, hey, I'm saying no, like up front, I don't want this book right now. However, she's like, if you had queried this 5 years ago, I would have bought it because it would have sold. Right now, the urban fantasy market is on its way toward dying. This was like 10 years post Twilight. And she's like, it's out now. If I had this 5 years ago, I would have bought it. And I'm telling you this so that you know that you're a good writer and something's going to hit for you, but it's not this book because this genre is dead and no one's going to be able to sell this book. And that rejection letter was what kept me going at that point, because she was a really well-known children's agent. And she was like, you're a good writer and you're going to make it. And so this was a rejection that actually made me keep going and push through. And I have told that particular agent multiple times. She is not my agent. I have a different agent. But I have told her multiple times, you're the reason why I didn't quit. And she's always like, that's so cool. And I'm so glad to hear that a rejection is what made you keep going.
That's so awesome. That's so inspiring just to hear. I mean, I think that what you were saying about, taking some breaks, but having something always on the horizon, quitting when it gets way too much. I mean, that is just so inspiring. I love how, when you got the rejections, instead of just letting it totally crush you down, you still kept your eye on the goal. And you let that actually help you rise above. And so that is just so amazing. I hope that the listeners out there really get some good value from that and, follow in your footsteps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And another piece of advice that I hear often, that I hear writers giving other writers, is that they have to, or that they need to write every day in order to improve. And I don't agree with that particular piece of advice. I will go, not now, not at this particular point in my life, but there was a time in my life that I would go 4 to 6 months without writing because I didn't need to be writing. Like, it wasn't on a schedule, it wasn't on a deadline. And if I didn't feel it, I didn't write. And this was after I was published. And if I didn't have a deadline staring me down, I'd just be like, no, I'm not feeling that today. You don't have to write every day in order to be a writer. And I particularly like take umbrage with that advice because I see a lot of people that want to write hear that and just think it's gospel and be like, oh, well, I guess I'm not a writer because I don't have time to write every day, or I don't even want to. And that's okay. Like, believe me, I don't do that, baby. I have so many days. In fact, almost every day, writing is the last thing that I'll do. I will, especially when I'm on deadline, and most authors will tell you this, we are the best procrastinators. We will find anything else and convince ourselves that has to be done first. I defrosted my entire deep freeze one time rather than write when I was on deadline, because every time I sit down in front of my laptop, every time I open up a new document or I pull up what I'm working on, I am terrified and I am thinking, what if I can't this time? What if this doesn't work this time? Because we don't know what this is. Like, this is something that we've been gifted. And so when we sit down and we go to write, we don't even, most of us even, we don't even actually know what we're accessing. We don't have, I mean, we all have processes and rituals that will help us get into our mode, but there's something like essentially magical about it. And we're not always even like, it's hard to explain, but I can't say that I know exactly what it is that I'm doing when I write. I just know how to tell a story. And it is something that is inherent in me and in who I am. And I've always been spinning stories in my head. Like, even when I was a little kid, this is what I did. And I can't imagine not making up stories in my head when I am around people that aren't writers, which of course, many people aren't. I just wonder what their brains are like. It's like, what are you thinking about right now? If you're not making up a story in your head, I don't know.
That's so interesting and such a good point to make. Yeah, everyone is different in their own ways, and that's so beautiful. You know, being a writer, it seems like I I totally agree that you don't have to write every day. I mean, I used to have a blog, which is, not the same thing, but I used to have a blog and I used to publish a new blog every single week. First, it was like 1 page a day, or, like I would beat myself up if I didn't write at least 1 page a day. And then I
Yeah.
was like 4 pages a day. And then it just became so exhausting, like
Yeah.
literally to a point where I was like, I was forcing myself to write. And it's like, when it comes from like creativity, like you can't just force creativity to flow in. Like, it comes when it wants to come. And so like I just got totally burnt out. I stopped blogging, and just recently in the past month, I've actually started writing again. But I think like you have to know when to stop, because otherwise you're going to burn yourself out and it's going to make you not want to do it.
Yeah,
So
you have to refill the well. And
yeah.
a lot of people forget to do that. You can grind it out and make it happen. I'm currently doing that. I'm on deadline. And I do, like, there are times when I just have to force myself to sit down and do the work. And so you can't force inspiration. There's no doubt about that. That is something that is just given to you, and it can come as a lightning bolt. It can come as years of something forming in your mind. You can't force that, but you can force yourself to write. And it's not fun, and it sucks, and usually like it takes time to get that ball rolling, mentally and even emotionally when you sit down in front of your laptop. But you can grind it out and still produce something of value. I'm currently grinding it out on my deadline, and it's not easy when something that you love to do and something that you did for pleasure and as a hobby for your entire life then becomes a job and you have to do it even when you don't want to. That's a transition, and you have to learn some new skills because you are on deadline now. And deadline doesn't care if you're not feeling it today. You got to put your butt in the chair. And so that's something that you can make yourself right. And you have to often, but you can't force inspiration. That's true.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have a podcast and a blog. Do you have any main messages from those platforms that you'd like to share?
Yeah, my blog and my podcast are both called Writer, Pants on Fire. And it's called that because I think about writing as just like in some ways being a professional liar. So I always say the motto of the podcast is authors talking about things that never happened to people that don't exist, because I have fiction authors on. And so we just talk about whatever it is their particular genre is, because I write across genres. I've written mystery, fantasy, contemporary, thrillers, you name it, except for romance. I haven't written that. And that is just fascinating. I'm always interviewing other authors on the blog and on the podcast and talking to them about their process, because every single person does it differently. Like there might be people listening to me right now being like, oh my gosh, she sits down and grinds it out. Like that's sacrilege. You shouldn't do that. And there are probably plenty of published authors that agree with that and would say, no, like you wait for the muse to come and that's where the good work is. And that's fine. And kind of the whole point of the blog and podcast is that there is no set way to do this thing. There is no set way to publication. Self-publishing now is a phenomenal field. It's totally different from traditional publishing as far as skill sets go. You have to be a marketer and an entrepreneur and know how to set up ads and do things correctly in order to perform well. And there's a lot of, like, quite frankly, math involved, and marketing and publicity if you want to be self-published. But the quality of self-published work is just eons ahead of what it was 10 years ago. So there's not even just one way to get published now. And there's certainly more than one way to write. Every single person does it differently. I have friends that when I talk about my process, because there's two basic types. There's a planner and a pantser. And I'm a pantser. I write by the seat of my pants, which is why it's called Writer, Pants on Fire. I don't know what's going to happen in my books. I just start writing and I see what happens. And I have friends that I share this with them and they think that I'm completely insane. And they don't understand how I have written 10 novels using this process where I just sit down and start writing and see what happens. And I have friends that just get like even a little bit of anxiety talking to me about my process because I delay. I'll write a book in about 2 months. 2 to 3 months is a novel length delivery time for me. And I just wing it pretty much the whole time. And I have friends who will spend 9 months writing a book and the 3 months before that we're planning the book. And so to hear my process just makes that it's suffering for them. And when I listen to their process, I'm just like, yeah, that's insane. I would never do that. It would just kill my creativity. And it's just fascinating. There's no one way to do it. And everybody does it differently. And even each author does book differently. So I will have different approaches usually for each book. And I don't necessarily know what it's going to be until I start it and I get in there.
Yeah. Well, that's so amazing that this profession is something that, like you said, you believe everyone can do. There's no one way to do it. I think that's just so amazing. And there's a great community of people, it seems like, that are there for each other. I love that you have this platform to raise the awareness of the diversity within the community and inspire people. I think that's just amazing.
Yeah. I mean, I love the community. I love my fellow writers. I mean, the friends that I have made in the writing community are, friends for life. And it's like people finally who understand me. It's great.
Yeah, Totally. I think that's one thing that people might not necessarily know until they actually do it, that when you are in a space, like I have made so many friends, I think that will be lifelong friends through my podcast, especially. And yeah, I mean, it's funny you mentioned you're the kind of person that thinks what could go wrong. I'm the
Yeah.
kind of person that thinks more so like what could go right.
Yeah.
And so, um, you know, with my podcast, I'm always thinking like, I'm always like reaching out to a lot of people, like hoping to have interviews with them and stuff like that. And sometimes the interviews lead to like just friendships and amazing connections. So, you know, I think for people who are creative, there, just go out there, at least try it and try to share it. I think one of the things that I've noticed about people who are creative is they get very shy to put themselves out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of writers are. And then a lot of them, and that can be like a barrier. And I would never tell someone not to be themselves. But if you want to, at either self-publishing or traditional publishing, if you want to be good at being an author, you do need to have, you don't need to have, but it is good to have a certain amount of the ability to put yourself out there just so that you can do public speaking and things like that. Orally communicating is really important as a storyteller. But of course, you don't have to. For everyone, it's their own level of comfortability. I started out being a huge fan of social media, and like I had an account everywhere and I was always posting stuff. And I've been doing that for years, and I kind of burnt out lately. And I was just like, I don't know if this actually sells books. I don't like putting myself out there for digital consumption in little bit bites, It's like, this is what I had for dinner and this is my dog, and I'm just like, you don't need to know that about me. You don't need to know what I'm eating or what my puppy looks like in order for you to read my books. And it's like, in the end, the goal is that I want you to be connected to my work. And if you also would like to enjoy a connection with me as a human being, like there are ways to do that across social media. But I really got tired of trying to sell myself as a human being. And it's something that I don't know how compatible that is with the world we live in now. But I have hit a point where I'm not necessarily going to market myself as a person anymore. I want people to hear my words more so than feel my presence. Let's put it that way. And so it's something that everybody kind of has to just measure about their levels of comfortability, what they want to do. Like if you're on social media and you hate it, it is really obvious. And you shouldn't do it. And the same is true of public speaking. Like if you really hate it and you're seriously uncomfortable, it's not going to sell books for you, and it's going to make you uncomfortable, and it makes it awkward for people sitting there trying to listen to you. So everybody just has to make their own decisions about what is best for themselves and where their traits and abilities lie.
That's really important to know. I totally agree. Like knowing yourself, knowing where your strengths are, and really putting the energy into what you are strong at and what you're not, and like kind of just leave it to someone else to what you're not as strong at. Yeah.
Don't try to jam yourself in that mold. I mean, I did it for a while, and I think it was true and honest with who I was at the time. And then, people change, and I kind of moved on from really like wanting to take pictures of my new coffee mug and share it with the world. And I'm just like, well, that's dumb. I don't see how this helps anyone. But, maybe I'll swing back around and be like, maybe somebody really needs to see my coffee mug today, and that's what makes their day better. I mean, I truly don't know. And I'm likely to change my opinion on that 3 or 4 more times.
Yeah. Yeah. Something that popped in my head that I'm wondering is, would 12-year-old Mindy be proud of you today?
Yeah. What's interesting is that 12-year-old Mindy would not understand that 41-year-old Mindy is not completely happy and elated all the time. Because I have everything that I wanted. Like, this is the life that I wanted. I literally live in the house that I always wanted to live in. Like, when I was a little kid, this house, it's really old. It was built in the 1850s, and it's right around the corner from my mom and dad's house. Well, right around the corner in country terms, so it's like 3 miles away. But I would go past this house every day on the school bus, and I'd be like, God, I want to live in that house. I want to live in that house. I want to live in that house. And that was something that was able to happen for me. It wasn't necessarily attached to writing. I was married when I bought this house, but I have, you know, everything that at 12, if you could have asked me to write an outline of what I want, it probably would look like this. And if you had told 12-year-old Mindy, yeah, you're going to have that, she would have been like, 41-year-old Mindy has no problems, and like not understood that, no, it doesn't fix anything. Like, you still have depression, and you still have insomnia, and you still have anxiety. You still have those things. It doesn't fix you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the things I heard this really great example. I don't remember exactly by who, but the example was, when you're young, you look in the mirror, you see yourself young. You're older, you look in the mirror, you see yourself older. And he said, what's important is who is looking in the mirror, because your body's going to change. And I think that person inside, I believe, is our consciousness. That doesn't change.
Right.
And so, you know, I think as we grow, really what's important is to go within ourselves, because that's never going to change.
Yeah. And like I said, if even teenage me, if you would have said, these are the things that you have, and shown me my life in 30 years, I really would have been like, oh, she has no problems, right? And it's just like, no, you do. You have lots of problems, but they're just different problems. I mean, you're never going to attain like nirvana in this world. It's just not gonna happen.
Yeah.
You just have to learn how to deal with your problems, and how to not let yourself go into spirals, and not let your anxiety or your depression get the better of you, and to just like tap out when you need to. Be like, taking a nap, can't do it today.
So where can listeners find you online?
You can find me at my website, which is just mindymcginnis.com. It's MINDYMCGINNIS. So all my social medias are there. I'm mostly present on Twitter and Facebook. I do have an Instagram, and I do have a Dalmatian puppy, and he has been on my Instagram a lot lately. He's my quarantine puppy. And I have 5 cats. One of them was wandering around here. That was Gilly. And I have writerpantsonfire.com. Will take you to both the blog and the podcast.
Awesome. I'll definitely include that in the show notes and description. And my final question is, what does the universe mean to you?
When I think of the universe like as a whole, I am thinking of just like every living thing, from animals and plants to humans, but also like across the spectrum of time. Definitely like always taking into account the past. Like, that's always important to me. My house, like I said, is super old. It's built in the 1850s. And I think about that a lot. Like, I think about the people that lived here and the person that built it. And I actually went to the grave of the person that built this house. And I went to his grave. He was a Civil War vet, and was just like, hey man, thanks for building my house, you know? Because it's just like, everything is so interconnected, and it pops up in the weirdest ways. You'll see connections, and especially where I live, like rural communities. And there's this, it's its own universe too. It's like you being aware of the larger things at play, and then boiling it down to this little microcosm that truly out here where I live is its own world. I think about all those things a lot, just being aware of everything going on around you, which ties back into writing, just being aware, I think.
Yeah. Well, I love that. I love that so much. And, you know, I think that is such a great example for the universe. I mean, how everything ties into each other. It's beautiful. Well, I really appreciate, you know, taking the time to do this interview with me. and the insight that you shared. I had an amazing time.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay.